a defiant response from the Kremlin, Russia has effectively rejected the demand for a 30-day ceasefire. New peace initiatives from Putin. Ukraine is being threatened with an attack on May 12th and 13th. A fiery greeting to the occupiers. Details of the strike on the Russian military deployment point in the Kursk region. With expertise, how Zakharova, Simonian and Dmitriev saw drugs in Macron's napkin. He condemned Putin's war and is planning a visit to Ukraine, what President Zelenskyy and Pope Leo XIV discussed. All this and more in detail right now. Please subscribe and leave a like. Well, let's get started. The Kremlin does not accept ultimatums regarding a ceasefire with Ukraine and insists on resuming direct negotiations in Istanbul, without any preconditions. This was stated by Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Russian dictator Putin. As quoted by Russian media, Peskov responded this way to Europe's threats to impose additional sanctions against Russia if it does not agree to a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. He brazenly stated that supposedly you cannot speak to Russia in the language of ultimatums. In this way, he effectively rejected the proposal for a 30-day truce between Ukraine and Russia. Earlier, Germany demanded that Russia agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine by the end of Monday. In case of refusal, Berlin threatened new sanctions and increased military support for Ukraine. Later, French President Emmanuel Macron joined this call. Now, we all need to be prudent. Either Russia, Mr. Putin, is serious and wants peace, or it is not serious, and we must impose even more sanctions, Macron added. A possible meeting between Ukraine and Russia on May 15th should lead to good results. The bloodshed must be stopped. This was stated by US President Donald Trump during a conversation with journalists. Quote, "The meeting between Russia and Ukraine on Thursday is extremely important. I insisted that this meeting take place. I think something good could come out of it to stop the bloodshed. It's terrible. It's a slaughter," the American leader noted. Also, in Trump's opinion, Russia will agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Moreover, the American president even allowed for the possibility of his own presence at the negotiations in Istanbul. Whether Putin will go there and what he plans to discuss at the upcoming talks, our journalists have been looking into it.
Zelenskyy is expecting Putin for negotiations on Thursday, May 15th. In addition, a ceasefire from Russia is expected as early as today, May 12th.
Once again, as of today, it is very difficult to give a 100% guarantee that this meeting will take place, since what statements are being made not just once a day, but every few hours, naturally, even by the end of today, some changes are possible.
The president of Ukraine made a statement about the meeting after US President Donald Trump demanded that our country immediately agree to Putin's proposal to resume direct talks in Istanbul. However, whether Putin himself will come to the meeting with Zelenskyy is still unclear.
As far as I can remember, during the full-scale war, I recall Putin's visits to Beijing and Mongolia. Both Mongolia and China share a land border with Russia. Why is this important? Because Putin, especially after, they say in the media, Prigozhin was eliminated on Putin's orders after that whole story. Putin is afraid to fly far beyond his own country, where the air defense does not control the airspace, for the simple reason that it seems Putin has a fear that something might happen to his plane.
In Trump's opinion, a meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin would make it possible to find out whether the sides are ready to reach a peace agreement.
It gives the impression that we are witnessing something of a theatrical performance with the main spectator sitting in Washington. And it is specifically for Donald Trump that these statements are being made. That is, essentially, when Ukraine, together with its European partners, proposed a 30-day ceasefire, this was coordinated with the US, and we publicly offered it to Russia. In turn, Putin's representative said that this was an unacceptable condition. Then Putin recorded a statement in which he said that there would be no ceasefire and that the meeting would take place in Istanbul on the 15th.
The head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, stated that Russia would try to use the negotiation process as a cover to get out from under sanctions and simply deceive everyone. Yermak also drew attention to the importance of a ceasefire during the negotiation process.
As of the morning of May 12th, I want to emphasize there is no sense of a ceasefire. There was a strike on the Odessa region and the border regions of Ukraine are also under attack. In other words, essentially, Russia is already not fulfilling the conditions that Ukraine spoke about.
Even Trump, who is pressuring Ukraine to negotiate with the killer Putin about a possible end to the bloody war on Ukrainian territory, acknowledges the fact that Putin does not want an immediate ceasefire.
If Donald Trump continues to apply pressure, it is quite possible that President Zelenskyy will indeed come to Istanbul. And the leader of Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has already said that he would be glad to host this meeting. But by the way, he also added that he is waiting for a ceasefire. In other words, he has essentially joined the pressure that Europe is putting on Russia, and accordingly, he is also demanding this step from Russia.
Meanwhile, journalists, citing their sources, report that Zelenskyy is ready to go to a meeting with Putin even if the Kremlin does not agree to a ceasefire, while the latter has started, so to speak, to backtrack. The spokesperson for the Russian dictator Dmitry Peskov stated that Ukraine is supposedly not ready for negotiations.
Putin supported a ceasefire, but he raised a number of questions. He said that there is currently a certain momentum on the front. Russian troops are advancing, and advancing very confidently. So if we're talking about a ceasefire, what are you going to do about the arms supplies that are coming in daily from the United States and European countries?
He himself mentioned May 15th, so come to Istanbul before May 15th. But considering that he's afraid to fly, as I mentioned, I wouldn't be surprised if he looks for some other excuses. Russia will immediately demand, let's stop military aid. Let's have Ukraine sign something. And Ukraine is not going to sign anything. For this meeting, even if it happens without a ceasefire, there is only one condition, that the outcome must be a ceasefire.
The new Pope Leo XIV has called for a true, just and lasting peace in Ukraine and urged that everything possible be done to achieve it.
The Elysee Palace mocked Russian fake news about the trip of Macron, Merz and Starmer to Kyiv. During the visit, a video was recorded showing Macron hiding a crumpled white piece of paper and Merz holding an object that looked like a stick. The spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Zakharova, watched this video with a trained eye and confidently declared that the leaders were using drugs. Almost immediately, elite propagandist Margarita Simonyan joined her, as did even Putin's court negotiator, Kirill Dmitriev. Later, Macron's team responded sharply to such fake accusations. When European unity gets in the way, disinformation goes so far that a simple napkin is passed off as drugs. Beware of manipulation, was how the lie was commented on at the Elysee Palace. The French embassy in Ukraine called such actions by Russian officials irresponsible and senseless. But now, this next provocation is even more serious. Over the Russian military training ground, Kapustin Yar, in the Astrakhan region, from which Russia previously launched its Oreshnik missile at Ukraine, the occupiers have closed the airspace. What could this indicate or warn about? Watch further.
Russia is once again trying to intimidate Ukraine.
Oh, I can just see it right away. Ooh! Several billion people will say, ooh, how scary. Ooh!
In Russia, they've once again pulled out their imaginary joker and started waving it around. We're talking about the Oreshnik missile, so highly praised by Putin. The Russians have once again decided to try to scare us with a strike using this weapon. Of course, they're not doing this directly. Putin and his circle haven't said that a strike on Ukrainian territory is being prepared. However, such a possibility does exist. It's all because of the closure of the airspace over the Kapustin Yar test range. That's exactly where the Oreshnik was previously launched toward Dnipro. At that time, there was a similar flight ban. This time, the Russians announced the closure of the airspace on May 12th and 13th from 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, local time.
Let's start with the fact that even using the Oreshnik against Dnipro was ineffective. In other words, we're talking about what is essentially an expensive toy for Putin, which he found as a substitute for, nuclear weapons, because he hasn't dared to use nuclear weapons. And that's why he decided to use some other kind of weapon that would create a wow effect. And in fact, what we saw in the video footage from Dnipro was impressive. But again, if we talk about the combat use of this type of weapon, it is ineffective.
Putin himself knows this too. That's why the Oreshnik hasn't been mentioned for quite a long time. Even the propagandists didn't really threaten to blow anyone up with this missile.
A large number of Russian propagandists hardly cover the topic of the Oreshnik at all, because they understand that it's some kind of non-existent myth. And most likely the only ballistic missile that the Russian Federation actually has, which is effective and has demonstrated its effective use, is the Yars. This is an old Soviet missile that has been modernized, and most likely the Oreshnik is also just a modernized Yars. Therefore, most likely it should be said again that at such distances it is ineffective. In other words, it does not fulfill its combat mission. It cannot carry a warhead that would, cause significant destruction.
But if we talk specifically about the situation with the airspace, the Russians are indeed up to something. The closure will extend from the ground up to unlimited altitude. This is a standard measure during ballistic missile tests. Whether this is about Oreshnik or something else remains an open question.
Russia is waging war according to the Gerasimov doctrine. That is, it's not just about conducting military operations, but also about psychological pressure, strikes on the civilian population, and creating various other information waves aimed at inciting panic among the population. Therefore, the closure of the airspace over Kapustin Yar can be seen as an attempt, it seems, to once again test and launch Russian propaganda using Oreshnik.
But we should not underestimate Russia in its pursuit of terrorism.
In principle, from an engineering standpoint, we're talking about a weapon that is not very effective, but from the perspective of psychological pressure and let's say the madness of the Russian Federation, we have to acknowledge that in principle Russia might use it. But I am more than sure that in this case another launch of this Oreshnik will be unsuccessful, and Russia will lose not only Plesetsk but also Kapustin Yar.
If the Russian Federation still decides to launch the Oreshnik, we will find out about it soon enough. After all, we should not forget that Russia is required to notify the United States about the launch of such a missile. Washington, in turn, must warn Ukraine. As for the missile itself, in any case, it is nothing more than intimidation. The Russian Federation launches attack drones, cruise and ballistic missiles, KBs, and so on over Ukrainian territory every day. And the response to the Oreshnik should be the same as to any other means of attack. Do you hear the air raid siren? Go to shelter.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
A fiery greeting to the occupiers. Russians are complaining about a strike on a military deployment point in Rilsk. That's in the Kursk region. Also, the enemy lost a Torem-2 air defense system worth about $25 million at the front. Meanwhile, the occupiers themselves continue to drop aerial bombs on Russians. Meanwhile, the Kremlin dictator is seeking Ukraine's capitulation, hiding Russia's inability to achieve it on the battlefield, and is planning a new summer offensive.
Another enemy deployment point has been eliminated, and Russians have complained about a missile strike in Rilsk, Kursk region. Preliminary reports indicate that the deployment point of the 40th Marine Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces was hit.
A strike was carried out on the permanent deployment point, specifically the command and control post of the Russian army, using American weaponry, namely HIMARS. According to the objective monitoring data, the command and control post was completely destroyed. Moreover, there is information from the Russian side itself that allows this target to be identified as an exclusively military facility. That is both the evacuation of the wounded and accordingly the deceased servicemen of the Russian Federation have been recorded.
At this time, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to destroy Russian army personnel and military equipment at the front. National Guardsmen burned a Russian Torem-2 air defense system worth about $25 million. Drones dropped explosives on the enemy equipment several times. After that, the missile system caught fire and the Russian occupiers started to flee. What happened to the crew of the system is unknown. But one thing is known: the Russian occupation forces operate by the principle, punish your own so that others are afraid. The Russian army once again dropped a half-ton bomb on the Belgorod region. The shell had less than 60 kilometers left to fly before reaching Ukraine.
Yes, this is not the first case. According to reports from Russian media themselves, at least 70 accidental bomb drops have been recorded, 62 FABs, and 7 bombs equipped with a guided planning and correction module. It should be noted that this number of munitions was dropped by Russian aircraft, specifically on the territory of the Russian Federation.
And while the aggressor's army is striking its own people, the Russian dictator himself is trying to undermine cooperation and unity between the Ukrainian side and Europe and the United States, and continues to insist on achieving his goals, among which is the complete capitulation of Ukraine. This is evidenced by calls to start negotiations based on the interrupted discussions held in Istanbul at the end of March 2022, according to analysts from the American Institute for the Study of War.
As of May 2025, not even the intermediate stage of the so-called special military operation has been completed, namely the capture of the entire territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, not to mention the strategic objectives such as denazification, demilitarization, and other Russian nonsense. That is why Putin is trying to use so-called peace-loving rhetoric to promote exclusively the Russian vision of ending the war in Ukraine at the expense of territorial concessions from our country and the effective disarmament of Ukraine's defense forces.
Let us recall that Putin has refused to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. It is likely that he is betting on a summer offensive, according to the Center for Countering Disinformation.
It should be noted that the Russian army's offensive has not stopped. Ukraine's territorial losses for the month of April amount to about 175 square kilometers. Yes, that's 6 times less than in November of last year. But nevertheless, the Russian army has intensified the nature of combat operations along the entire length of the Russian-Ukrainian front.
And in addition, Russia has created a secret unit that specializes in sabotage, cyber attacks, and assassinations across Europe. According to Western intelligence agencies, this is a shadow organization called the Department of Special Future Tasks.
Iran will provide Russia with launchers for, most likely, the previously supplied short-range ballistic missiles, Fateh 360, to the aggressor's army. This was reported by Reuters. How could this affect the situation on the front line? Details in the report.
As they say, it hasn't even been a year. Back in September 2024, the United States stated that Iran was supplying its own missiles to Russia, delivering the shipments to Russia with 9 Russian-flagged ships that are not under sanctions. But if back then it was only about the missiles themselves, of which experts counted around 200 units now, according to journalists, Tehran is also sending its own launchers to Moscow along with them.
Iran is preparing to transfer launchers for Fateh 360 short-range ballistic missiles to Russia in the near future.
And although the number of launchers being transferred is unknown, it could be dozens or just a few experimental units, Western intelligence agencies are convinced that such signals point to a dangerously close relationship developing between Russia and Iran.
If the delivery of Fateh 360 launchers does take place, it will help support Russia's devastating offensive against its neighbor and confirm the deepening of security ties between Moscow and Tehran.
As for Ukraine, Iran's transfer of such launchers would mean much more intense shelling of frontline cities.
These systems will be used predominantly to shell frontline cities, and indeed to destroy Ukrainian armed forces personnel and military equipment. To prevent this from happening, it is essential to make appropriate and timely decisions very quickly.
It should be acknowledged that the Iranian Fateh 360s, unlike the inaccurate makeshift North Korean missiles, are a much more formidable weapon, experts assert.
The missile weighs about 800 kilograms, with a warhead of around 120 to 150 kilograms. The strike range is about 90 to 110 kilometers. So essentially it is an analog of Russian multiple launch rocket systems, which use the same guidance systems. That is, it is an inertial and satellite axis. Although, of course, in terms of its flight trajectory, but in terms of its characteristics and speed, it reaches about 3 to 4 Mach. It belongs to the class of ballistic weapons.
In the West, Iranian Fateh 360 missiles are even compared to modern American HIMARS.
This, friends, is the equivalent of the American HIMARS. There is already a lot of information circulating in foreign media about the specifications of these missiles. In essence, they are very similar to the HIMARS we received from the United States back in 2022, which were used very effectively at the front to drive the Russians out of the right bank of the Kherson region and the Kharkiv region.
However, unlike the American HIMARS, it will be much easier for Ukrainian defenders to knock the Iranian Fath missiles off course or neutralize them long before they reach their target.
By interfering with satellite navigation systems, it will be possible to either deflect these missiles in a certain way or jam them, thereby reducing their accuracy. The greater the range, the lower the accuracy will be.
But military analysts are convinced that the enemy's capabilities should not be underestimated either. In addition to medium-range missiles with a range of 100 to 110 kilometers, Iran, if it wishes, can also provide Moscow with its far more deadly developments.
Iran also has other modifications of the Fath missile, specifically the 110 with a range of 300 kilometers, the Fath 313 with up to 500 kilometers, and the Zulfikar with a range of 700 kilometers. All of these, friends, are ballistic missiles, extremely dangerous for Ukraine.
But they are only dangerous if Iran actually transfers its weapons to the Kremlin. Let's not forget, according to intelligence reports, the Faj 360 missiles themselves have been lying around in Putin's warehouses since last year. Without the Iranian launchers, they are nothing more than inaccurate, expensive heaps of metal, which is still the case today. According to not just domestic but also Western analysts, such a long pause between the delivery of the missiles themselves and the discussions about transferring the launch systems indicates that Tehran is more interested in reaching an agreement with the United States than with Moscow.
Russia's deployment of missiles could complicate U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts to organize a ceasefire and peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Indirect negotiations between the U.S. and Iran on the nuclear program taking place with Oman's mediation are one of several reasons for the delay in the delivery of the launches.
As a result, Tehran may not send the Iranian launchers being discussed today anywhere at all. It is possible that they could become part of a new deal with the United States in exchange for easing sanctions pressure on the country. And the talk about possibly transferring another batch of deadly weapons to Putin is merely a bargaining chip in the ongoing negotiations with the White House.
The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, announced yesterday that he had his first phone conversation with the new Pope, Leo XIII. Zelenskyy described the conversation as very warm and substantive. According to him, he and the Pope agreed to plan a personal meeting in the near future. He expressed his gratitude for the support of Ukraine and all our people. We greatly appreciate His Holiness's words about the need to achieve a just and lasting peace for our country and the release of prisoners, wrote the president of Ukraine. However, in an interview for the Peruvian publication Semanario Expresión, which was published on May 9th, and Pope Leo XIV sharply condemned Russia's war against Ukraine in calling it a true invasion, imperialistic in nature, where Russia seeks to conquer territory for reasons of power. His words stood in stark contrast to the cautious rhetoric of his predecessor, Pope Francis, who in his statements did not always directly identify the party responsible for this war. Crime bosses, thieves-in-law, organized criminal groups and gangs are not just symbols of the turbulent 90s. These people haven't just disappeared, they now control Russia. And the main bandit of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is helping them do it. Watch on to find out how the thugs from the 90s became Russia's elite. And to make sure as many people as possible learn the truth about these ghouls, please like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel Ukraine Today. The Bandit Vertical. How did the Mafia merge with Russian power? Once they were called the thugs of the wild 90s. Today, they are simply the authorities. In this investigation, the Navalny Live team reveals how crime bosses and leaders of organized crime groups became friends of the president, sponsors of the military, and masters of Russia. He got rich in St. Petersburg during the years when a young Putin was in the city administration. And he also became a figure in an international investigation into the Russian mafia.
When Putin was working in the St. Petersburg city administration in the 90s, Petrov's business was booming. Gennady Petrov was a co-founder and major shareholder of Bank Russia, the very same Bank Russia that we now know as the Bank of Putin's friends.
And by 2008, Petrov found himself at the center of Spain's largest anti-crime operation, Troika.
In the summer of 2008, the Spanish police carried out a large-scale special operation, codenamed Troika. 20 people were detained in 4 cities across Spain. The target of the operation was the so-called Russian Mafia, say, the members of the Tambov-Malishev organized crime group led by Gennady Petrov.
However, during this case in Spain, there were also key witnesses, but they were dealt with quickly.
A crucial witness, Mikhail Monastyrsky, gave testimony in the Spanish case. He managed to tell the Spanish authorities that the Tambov organized crime group was overseen by the FSB itself, which had created the gang for the purpose of enrichment. A month after giving this testimony, Monastyrsky suddenly died. He was hit by a cement truck in France.
And now let's talk about the so-called night governor of St. Petersburg. He used to handle matters with officials, seize businesses, and then decided to go legitimate.
If before he controlled all of St. Petersburg, actively bribed officials and law enforcement officers, engaged in smuggling and raids, then in the early 2000s he tried to create the image of an honest businessman, attempting to legalize his criminal activities. He bought up houses on Nevsky, agro-industrial holdings, and transport companies. He also maintained close relationships with many well-known people.
And in the 2000s, the old methods made themselves known again. Kumarin was arrested in a particularly spectacular fashion.
In 2007, during a redistribution of assets, Moscow officers armed with automatic weapons and wearing masks staged a high-profile arrest of Kumarin in St. Petersburg. A few years later, he was sentenced to 24 years in a penal colony for raider takeovers and contract killings.
And now about the Podolsk-Izmailovo organized crime group. In the 90s, they seized factories, killed people, and collected debts by force. With Putin's rise, they became more socially oriented.
With Putin's arrival at the FSB, the Podolsk and Izmailovo groups were given carte blanche across the entire country. They began seizing factories and mines. Having established themselves and started making serious money, the Podolsk group also took up social initiatives. Their main creation is the sports club Vityaz.
However, the head of the gang is now a sponsor of the army and the recipient of a certificate from the president himself.
Here is a certificate from the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Obviously, the Mafia in Russia hasn't disappeared. It just put on suits, received state awards, and moved into mansions. Today, the criminal world has become political, and the political world has become criminal.